Thank you, Pastor Paul. Anybody woke here?
Yeah, how do you define it?
Yeah, how do you define it? I know he's woke. He's got coffee over there.
I'm awake.
You're awake? Not woke, though. You could be awake, but not woke. Now, how many of you guys have heard the term woke or wokeness? Who hasn't? Who said that? All right, so tell me, though, what have you heard or what have you looked into about wokeness? Yeah, the term woke, okay, came from within the Black community, meaning what? And now, it's okay, Christians can disagree with one another, okay? Just because you disagree doesn't mean you're being woke either, okay? Right? Yeah, or apostate. That's old school terminology right there. Thanks, Mike. Only judges would use that language. You can't do rulings like that. You apostate, you're doing 5 years. Okay, what else? What else have you guys heard about wokeness? Black community, they need to be social justice. Do you guys believe that wokeness is connected with social justice and vice versa?
Yeah, I do.
Is that a yes?
Yeah.
Going once, going twice? Can you care less?
I care.
You care. Okay. But you're just not sure, though.
Right.
And that's why you're here. God bless you. All right. So what else? And it's true. It is mixture. If you see some social justice, we're going to talk about that in a minute, inevitably, the ideology behind that will be wokeness. Okay. And I'm going to give you guys 4 points about that tonight. Now, I'm giving you guys like this tonight. Okay. Not that. So I'll encourage you afterwards if you want to like go deeper, like where you should be, searching and what kind of trusted sources to get this from. Okay. What else have you heard about wokeness? Anything else? Is there any major players? Is there a show? Is there a movie that you've seen recently? Is there a talk show? Is there a podcast? Is there a YouTube channel? Is there a movement that you've seen wokeness demonstrated? All of them? The gay community, okay. More on the Democratic side than the Republican side. Anything else? Do you know any individual? Like who's a person today that is fairly well known? I don't care if they're a politician, a business person, or a musician. Like so, let's go specific.
Depends what
A lot of
media you
the
listen
media on the TV.
Like an NBC, ABC, CBS, CNN, MSNBC. Does that still exist, MSNBC?
Yeah.
Because there's still 3 people watching, so,
Right, exactly. But a lot of them.
So a lot of the main head,
Mainstream media.
yeah, the mainstream media, which is, we shouldn't be called the mainstream anymore because they're not.
Well,
Fox News is becoming a little woke. They got some woke people there.
yes.
By the way, if you guys on the Christian side, are Christians becoming woke?
Yes.
So that's why we're asking the question. Is that a good or bad thing?
You got to define the term.
Yeah,
That's what we're doing right now, Mike. Yes. You need to be more woke.
So back to the definition.
I haven't given it yet. I'm getting it from you guys.
Like they think
Is because I'm biracial. That's why I care. No. You're like you're writing it down. Yeah, here's what's. Let me just say this. This is what's really sad. Like in the Christian circles, even like us Christian apologists, like they're like, hey, your last name's Jimenez. Can you teach on anti-racism? Like you can't get a white guy to do it now because that's just not good, right? So you got to go get your black friends or your Mexican friends, and all of a sudden we're like important people now, So I care because as I've been a pastor for many years, working with young people, and I started to see this trend, this worldview stuff. Everybody has a worldview, meaning how you see the world, right? And the way you interpret the world or reality as we know it and the values that you think are important, those have eternal consequences. So that's why I care, because I believe the gospel, right, is the one true answer in Jesus Christ. Jesus is the gospel. It's a person. So that's why I care. And so what happens is in that is you have other worldviews that are being propagated by Satan and other movements and world religions So my profession, my background, it was in philosophy, theology, and apologetics. And so when you're taking theology, philosophy, apologetics, you learn about world religions, different worldviews, and over time you hear about these terminologies about critical race theory or anti-racism or social justice stuff, whatever the case may be. And so my background is I study these kind of stuff for a living, and then I come to churches like this or conferences and I write on them, I speak on them. So I help Christians defend against false ideologies or false worldviews. Does that make sense? Now, on top of that, when we're dealing with wokeness, this is where, when I pose the question, should we? I want you guys to consider what is taking place, because what we tend to do sometimes, and yes, some denominations can do some of a disservice more than others, and that is when we see something immediately that is not biblical, we go into attack mode, right? And we blast those people, like, because we have to defend our ground. And it's almost like the Christian nationalists are trying to protect America and our freedoms. So anybody who's out opposing it, like, we're going to kill them, right? And we stand by our Second Amendment rights. Now, if I was in Texas saying that, I'd be like, amen, right? But we're in Michigan. So, and there's a danger to that. And I want us to be able to see that a lot of people who are becoming woke, and we'll get into that in a minute, it's not a one definition. That's why I'm going to give you guys 4 different fields of study that are contained within wokeness. Okay, in America, we like definitions. I said in my earlier session, we like to label things, right? Put things in their little box. And we feel like by doing that, we've like either solved the world crisis problem by putting a label on it, or that we've clarified something, and so we either become dismissive or we get involved. Some of that's okay, but that's not what I want us to do here. So I'm not just going to give you a nice little tidy definition, Mike, and then you guys go with that, and then you guys just disseminate that definition to the rest of the people, because then what happens is now it's wokeness versus anti-wokeness. That's what happens. Instead of being Christians who are witnesses in a dark, perverted world. Does that make sense? And let me say, a lot of our friends who are progressive or they're becoming woke, which now is becoming both and. I said last night, if you're with me, about hijacking Jesus, if you notice, one of the pillars of progressive Christianity is LGBT. I mean, that is on par to the Bible is a serious document, they like to say, but we don't take a literal interpretation of it. So LGBT is on par to taking the Bible seriously. So think about that, okay? So wokeness and progressivism is collectively there. Now, the wokeness we're going to see tonight is not the ideology. It's not the worldview. The progressivism is the worldview. The wokeness is the value system living out that worldview. Does that make sense? Yes? Progressivism is the worldview. The wokeness is the value system being lived out according to progressivism. So even by looking at what wokeness is, does not mean that we're undercutting the worldview. We're looking at one aspect, okay, of progressivism. So wokeness, we're going to be looking really at as a value system of how we treat human beings. Does that make sense? Now, how we treat them is based on how we, get this is based on the value system of human beings. Now, as I dissect this, I want to throw this out because the woke people are for abortion, but they're against injustices and people who are oppressed. Can you think of anybody more oppressed than the unborn in the womb? But you're not going to get a woke person defending that human right. I want you to keep this in mind. So wokeness breaks down, okay? Wokeness breaks down. Now, Mike will like this. The standard and the universal definition. Mike's like, it's about time. Now I'll start taking notes.
What have we been doing?
This is not my definition. This is a standard universal definition that's used in universities, on the internet, YouTubers, right? That kind of stuff that you'll kind of see is, quote, to be alert to injustice in society, to be alert to injustice in society, especially oppression and racism. Now, on the face of it, what say you, Christian? I'm going to assume all of you guys are, for the most part, Christian, not every one of you, but for the most part, let's say. What say you? When I give you that definition, do you have a problem with that? To be alert to injustice in society, especially oppression and racism. I don't. But see, if you were with me last night with progressivism, I was teaching you guys what? The subtleties in some aspects of how they lure you in, and yet progressive Christianity denies Jesus as God. Can you have salvation without Jesus being God? Does Christianity exist without a resurrection, without a bodily, physical, literal resurrection of Christ? But progressive Christianity, at the heart of it, rejects a physical, bodily, literal resurrection of Christ. So what we actually have with progressive Christianity, and don't be tricked by the term before Christian, by being progressive, right? Being enlightened. Progressive just means what? We've evolved. We've learned more than what we've in the past. So you binary Christians, black and white Christians, no pun intended here, that right there is rigid thinking. That's traditional orthodoxy that has lost its persuasion in our culture today. So you guys think that there's immutable truth. But truth is changeable today, right? It's ever evolving. And the sooner you learn that, the sooner you open your eyes to Jesus everywhere. And the more woke you become. The more you start looking at injustices and start seeing, now catch this, wokeness ties in the injustices and the oppression that's predominantly being brought upon by two particular groups. And guess who they are? White people and white religious people. Now, let's go back to some of the channels that you guys have mentioned. Politics, let's say it's a big thing, okay? Politics is a big thing. No question. That's why us Christian apologists, we teach in our worldview training, we teach on politics. In my book, Challenging Conversations, I cover on politics. So because politics essentially is just a way of life. It's how we legislate morality in our society. So if you don't think that's important, okay, then you're lost. It does matter. Now, do I believe in a Republican versus Democrat? No, I think that's a joke as well, to be honest, okay? So we limit ourselves sometimes in tribalism. Wokeness, okay, and this is where we've gotten caught up into this. What wokeness has done in all these channels is they have put front and center. Remember I told you based on wokeness, who are the two camps that have caused the most oppression and injustices, or who? White people, and mainly religious white people. So guess what that's phrased as in America today? Called Christian nationalists. Now, how many of you guys heard that in this last election? All the time. Now, do I believe in Christian nationalism? I don't. But I'm not here to talk about that, okay? Do I believe in patriotism? Do I love this country? Yeah, I wrote a book called Stand Strong America. I care about our country and the Judeo-Christian ethic that this nation has had. There's been no constitution like our founding documents ever, okay? I love our country. I'm proud to be American. Let's sing that song right now. Wokeness labels immediately that as Christian nationalists, almost like we're under this theocracy. In this rule, this patriotic rule, where all you women are slaves to men, right? And you use religion and God, and if you look through the history books, you see that religion has caused most of all the wars. So wokeness is saying, we're done with that, okay? We're more enlightened today. We're about justice. We're about freedom for all. We're about the oppressed people, the women have been, and a lot of that is good. So that's why when I say, should Christians be woke, we're not going to fall prey to the terminology in our culture today, but we have to also understand what's happening when it comes to the injustices and the oppressions that's happening. You know what I'm saying? Guys, Who built the churches? Who built the schools? Who built the hospitals? Christians. You want to talk about being woke before woke was cool? Christians were already doing that. So don't fall prey to think all of a sudden like, oh yeah, like, yeah, I know. The church is rigid and the church, we can fall prey to that. So to be alert to injustice in society, especially oppression, racism. So look, when I'm talking to woke people, I even do that now. It's funny. Like I'm on secular campuses. I'm like, hey, are you woke? Like, amen, absolutely. I got it tattooed right here. You know what I mean? So it's like woke is the cool thing, right? I'm woke, When I go to Starbucks, I say, can I get a woke coffee? They totally know what that is. The idea is I'm making sure that I get it. Like you see injustice now. The solution though is where we part ways. But on the face of it, I feel where they're going. Okay. Now the New York Times posted an article. If you're woke, you dig it, by William Melvin Kelly. Now, it's a very colorful article back in the 60s by a black journalist individual that was unpacking the civil rights movement. So this is actually one of the first times that we start seeing this terminology that's being used. If you're woke, you dig it. And it was awakening the black people to no longer be under the oppression of whites. Like you can live life without white people. And that's one, before the civil rights movement happened, a lot of them were saying, you know what, let's stop using this as an excuse and let's band together and start supporting black communities, black business owners, et cetera. A lot of that's good, okay? And this is before 1964, before the Civil Rights Act. Now, another thing we have to understand is it's intertwined nowadays with the Black Lives Matter. So there's a lot of the civil rights movement that I agree with, but there's most of the stuff I don't agree with when it comes to the ideology that's backed by the Black Lives Matter, okay? So you can see how wokeness has changed in the last, 50 plus years, okay? Now, there's also a song that Erykah Badu wrote called Being Woke. And this was about 10 years ago plus now. There's foul language in it. And I got Paul's permission to use the foul language. No, I'm teasing. I didn't. I'm just going to give you just a little phrase from this. It's called Master Teacher, okay? And this really became the popular song from a hip hop artist, and it was displayed on, big TV channels, and, it's got tons of views on YouTube. But he says, I am known to stay awake, a beautiful world I'm trying to find. I've been in search of myself, a beautiful world, it's just too hard for me to find. So it's basically someone who's been oppressed, someone who has felt less than, who's finding themselves and is arising from this oppression, okay? Not depression, but oppression, okay? And he goes on and says, what if it were no inward, only master teachers, I stay woke, dreams. So it's like the shackles, right? And a lot of that terminology comes from what? Slavery. And so the shackles today, since the civil rights, has been what? We could be better as a black community than what white people have allowed us to be, or even ourselves, even within our own community. So the wokeness isn't just saying, stop letting white people oppress you. It's saying what to black people in general?
Lift yourself up.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so the reason I share this with you guys, because I have some friends who've written on this stuff, and they just take a real Southern Baptist point of view, and it's and it gets too technical, too academic, and they're missing the humanity aspect of it. And I think that they're judging them too harshly. And, I will be honest, and a lot of them are academic white people. So I come with a sense of caution here, because I grew up in a very highly populated Black and Hispanic community in Tucson, Arizona. And obviously being biracial and coming from a Catholic background mixed with a Southern Baptist, I've seen the difference of how the Morris family on my mom's side treated the Jimenez family. And I will tell you, from my personal experience, the white side of the family mistreated more often the Hispanic side of the family than the other way around. When the Morris family, which on rare occasions, this is back in the 80s, invited the Jimenez family over, the Jimenez family didn't have manners. The Morris family did. The Morris family was on time. The Jimenez family wasn't. In the end, guess how the Jimenez family felt? Judged, right? Which is not good enough. It was very uncomfortable, and it didn't work, and that was it. So as we got older, that stopped. The Morris family and the Jimenez family did not hang out. So obviously being biracial, I'm trying, as I get older, I'm trying to spend time with the white family but mostly was close to the Jimenez family, okay? So I get some of what we see within this language. So we have to be careful. Everybody who says they're woke or says we need to be more woke, whatever, don't immediately judge that person as though they're teaching a false gospel. Here's the thing, you guys. A lot of us, when we read a definition like that, we're like, well, I don't see the problem. And you have to give that person the benefit of the doubt. Okay? Now, is there an agenda behind it? Absolutely, there's an agenda behind it. And hopefully, when we go through this time tonight, you'll be better equipped when you're now watching something or having a discussion, but we be more prayerful and look to have those challenging conversations with people who, for example, now, who think that white fragility is like a disease. So now what's happening from civil rights to this terminology of wokeness, we have people like Robin DiAngelo, who is a white educated professor, a woman, who wrote a book, a New York Times bestseller, that a lot of Fortune 10 companies are using across the board, including Mecklenburg County, that has almost 1 million people. It's the biggest county in Charlotte. And they had people like Robin DiAngelo come educate our teachers and pay them, her and this guy named Ibram X. Kendi, who wrote a book, several books, but the more famous one is How to Be an Anti-Racist. We're paying them in the hundreds of thousands to educate our teachers to teach anti-racism and CRT in the public school. So they're strapped for cash, but they find ways to pay these woke educators who are teaching on white fragility. That's a terminology that Robin DiAngelo, and essentially what it is if any of you guys have whiteness in you, you have racism in you. It's inherent, including herself. So this is now what's happened to wokeness today. It's one thing when you are recognizing that mistreating someone of a different color is inhumane, and we need to fight for these rights. To then they take it to the streets in violence, and then through that process now, which of course we know before the Civil Rights Movement with Martin Luther King, they didn't act that way, but now, right, they do that, and you have to take a knee, and if you don't, it's because you're a racist, and you need to deny your whiteness and apologize and seek for reparations. You see how so there's a form of wokeness that can go to that extreme, where so the extreme wokeness is they are the racists, but they don't see it that way. You're the problem. So if we burn down a white person's business, that's a good thing. That was a justice. That was an act of justice that we had a right to do. That's an extreme view, okay? But we're not to see wokeness as that in its entirety. Does that make sense? So white fragility, white awakeness, if you will. This other book I told you guys about, How to Be an Anti-Racist, Be the Bridge, is a woke book that's circulating in the Christian churches today. Be aware of that book, Be the Bridge. My own church, there were several people in the mission local community that were sharing this. And it was brought to my attention with some of the elders. I'm not on staff at my church, and they're like, hey, how do we wrestle through this? And I gave a response. And so they shared that, and we removed it from the church and told those people to stop using it. This is why, politely, respectfully, gave a response to it. There's another book called The Color of Compromise, is a woke book that's built around CRT that you guys need to be careful with. Another thing before I get into these four things for you guys is let me go back to them. The first one was the civil rights had a liberal bent. Okay, the civil rights in the 60s to the 70s had a liberal bent. So the purity of the movement was not always, driven with biblical principles, okay? That eventually led to a form of activism that we saw on display in the 80s and 90s. Remember Rodney King kind of stuff? Really in the ghetto neighborhoods, they kept getting poorer. In the suburbs with white people kept getting richer type thing. So that was a huge discriminatory level that we saw. And that's when local politicians need to get involved, which should be pushed by local churches such as yourself. But when you lose that, things escalate to where we see now a cancel culture level. When the church has removed itself from the community and is not actively involved, cancel culture is inevitable. So you've seen how wokeness leads to cancellation of everything eventually. And why is that? If the definition, like I told you, on principle is to be alert to injustice in society, especially oppression and racism, how can I abuse that definition to where people start getting canceled? Let's go back. Who I told you guys, the two players, white people and religious white people, or Christian nationalists. And that's why, no joke, this is a fact, and this is from the ground, from one of the organizations I work with, Faith and Freedom, and another one, Freedom Foundation with Dave Diaz. So they work with a lot of the conservative base in Washington, D.C., and there are bills that they're attempting to pass. And one of them just that got squashed right now, the House passed it, but the Senate didn't, was the Marriage Equality Act. When you appeal the Defense of Marriage Act from the 90s of Bill Clinton to marriage equality, I'm telling you, they will use that to go against guys like Paul and myself, that if I say anything that runs contrary to the Marriage Equality Act, even though that's not constitutional law. The only thing constitutional about it is that our legislators passed a bill, which eventually was passed into law through the executive branch, right? Once it goes through the House and the Senate. That's the only thing constitutional about it. But the very essence of the Marriage Equality Act undermines. And the problem is because we've allowed government to redefine marriage. The Constitution talks about marriage? No. Does the Constitution talk about education? There are certain innumerable powers that the federal government is given, and education and marriage is not one of them. So when you start getting woke people that start saying this is oppression and this is an injustice, and you start having politicians who cater to these movements because it's an act of violence and they're scared. I'll give you one of them who's like probably the most woke person. She's like the epitome of wokeness is who? Yeah, that's right. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Okay, so she's by definition like a woke politician. Okay, and she drums up her support by saying Christian nationalists are destroying our democracy. Okay? So I'm a Christian nationalist by definition, according to her. Okay? But this is the same girl who doesn't know what a garbage disposal is. But, so this is what inevitably happens when you could take that definition, and so what you say is oppression, what you say is an injustice, you get canceled. But inevitably, who gets canceled in the end? Christians. Okay. Now, let me just give you a side note. When you see anti-Semitism on the rise, why is that? What's happening when you see anti-racism on the rise? So a form of socialism, but why the Jews? Why would let's look through history. Anytime there's a war, anytime there's a takeover, who's attacked? God's people. So in this wokeness, just keep an open eye. Who are the main people who are being attacked with wokeness that leads to cancel culture? Christians and Jews. Okay?
They're the basis for Christianity.
Yeah, so those are the things you guys have to. So again, civil rights had a liberal bent, led to a form of activism that got violent. 1968, 1969, as a result of that activism that got to become two of the most violent years in American history. Look it up. And now what we are faced with, your kids and grandkids are in cancel culture mode. Okay? I've been canceled. Challenging conversations because of the topics that we deal with, mental illness, LGBT issues, abortion, was pulled from Barnes & Noble. And what they do is they have a list and they send it out to the rest of people and say, don't buy this book. Okay? Now, as a business, if they don't want to carry it, what? Don't carry it. It's your business. But don't cancel something because you don't agree with it ideologically and don't think I have a right to express that in printed form. But is the church coming to our aids? No. A lot of us are left to defend ourselves with our lawyers and our nonprofits, right? So that's what we got to continue to pray. If you look at church history, it was the apologists, the people like the Justin Martyrs of the world that stood against the kings and false religions and were willing to die for it. And nowadays we have a bunch of pansy pastors who can't even mention when Roe v. Wade gets overturned. They can't even celebrate it. All right, so here's the scope and sequence thing with an imagery that I want to show you guys. In a nutshell, this is how wokeness is seen, okay? So there is no maleness and femaleness at the heart of humanity. That's binary, right? So you're fluid. Humans are fluid. So at the core of us in our soul, as Caitlyn Jenner said famously, physically I am a man, but spiritually, I am a woman. Hear me roar. No, he didn't say that. Or she. But this, we're fluid as humans. So in the core of a human is you define them based on their sexual orientation, their race, their privilege or their oppression, how much are they oppressed or not oppressed, and their gender identity. That's how we see humans now, okay? In the wokeness culture. Now, that's framed within these different worldviews. Equity, intersectionality, and I'm going to talk about each one of these four. So this is what this here is based on these four categories. And ultimately, when you want to talk about should we be woke, this is what I want to teach you guys in these four areas. They're not just one area. Now, can you be somebody who's more woke here with equity? Absolutely. And that's what you find with critical race theory that was first known as critical legal theory, was them trying to figure out why minorities live the way they live. Why is there so much crime within the Black community, for example? And what can we do about it? Housing program, like all of these type of things that we've seen through the decades where the government is trying to provide assistance, whether on a state level or federal level, nonprofits, whatever. They're trying to provide or cater to a community that does not have the resources like what predominantly white suburban families have. Does that make sense? Now, I will say I am a byproduct to a certain extent of equity, because in Tucson, Arizona, the vast majority of the people that lived in my zip code never went to college in their life and never had a way to go, okay? And that was the reality for where I grew up. So even when time came for me to look at the concept of going to college did not exist even for me. And I had been receiving academic scholarships. And my dad, being Hispanic and coming from the family he came from, my dad only had his GED. There was no talk whatsoever of me ever going to college. So it was actually a guy named Uvaldo Martinez who originated from Mexico and got educated in America and became a citizen and was one of the elders in my church where I was a youth pastor at the time, a young youth pastor. He took me under his wing, and he happened to be a college counselor for the local community college. And one time he challenged me and said, Jay, what's your plans? You know, you're a young youth pastor here, and are you ever going to go to school? I'm like, well, I'd got some of these invitations, I guess, from colleges, or I didn't even know how to explain it. And he's like, Jay, those were scholarships. I was like, okay. Isn't that sad? I had nobody to bounce this off of. Nobody. No, there was no support. I just didn't know. So Uvaldo says, well, hey, you know, we actually have programs for minorities. And I started to meet with him, and I got a transfer scholarship. And I of course, had a certain GPA in the local community. And then I finally went to the University of Arizona. And it was a program that helped minorities like myself. Okay, because I came out of an environment where nobody had a college degree, and we lived in poverty level. We didn't have the resources. Okay, so that's how this started. But like I just showed you with the civil rights to activism to cancel culture, you can see the danger of it, right? So this is a picture of wokeness, okay, at its core. So let's break down each one of them. Let's start with intersectionality. Now, who's heard of this term? What, in essence, what do you know of intersectionality? So intersectionality is where I go back to this. And what I do now, and I want you to hear from you guys in the workplace, school, even in churches or whatever. So the intersectionality is, let's say this is a female, right? Typically in our culture, have females been more oppressed than males? How so? Voting, property rights.
Trying to get a car fixed.
Trying to get a car fixed.
Just going to a shop.
Just go to the shop. They just see a female walking through and they just automatically assume a lot of times. Again, because when you're dealing with engineers and scientists and mechanics, it's predominantly 9 times out of 10 is. Hey, one day I was on a flight and guess what? The captain was female. When was the last time you guys had the captain of the plane was a female? You ever had that? I got nervous, to be honest, when I found. No. Huh?
9 out of 10 still for engineers.
Engineers is growing faster than the other areas, but still, aviation is growing a little bit. But the most of the time when you're going in these fields, there's predominantly going to be, right? So yes, in some ways, have women felt oppressed in that area, for sure. Work pay, right? Religion.
Heavy.
What world religion believes that women are second-class citizens?
Well, the Islam.
And Orthodox Jews. Yeah, there's no female, you can't be a priest. Yeah, so, yeah, women, one of their main primary things is to have kids so they can populate their celestial kingdom to come. So, okay, so let's say now what we've done in our intersectionality is we say, okay, if you look at an historical account, women have been more oppressed than men. So we're gonna identify this interconnected characteristic now in terms of wokeness, is that I see an injustice more with women than men. But now let's say this is a black woman versus a white woman. Who's more oppressed? But now let's say it's a black woman who's gay. She's a lesbian. Is she more oppressed than the black woman who's heterosexual? Right? So that's intersectionality. If we can interconnect more of these type of characteristics that make up this person based on race, sexual orientation, gender identity, privilege, and oppression. Now let's look at it. Now, if it's a black woman who's gay but drives a Mercedes, right? Versus a black woman who's transgender, because the transgenders will say they're more oppressed than gay people. I know, dude, come on. If it's a black gay woman who now says she's a man and eats at McDonald's and not Qdoba, That's more oppressed. The McDonald's woman. But I know, but it's like, but so social status is also a big one too. Okay? Now, again, in my life, growing up in Tucson, by the way, for you guys, it's not Tucson, it's Tucson. I grew up on the south side of Tucson, and it literally was this: poor, middle class, and rich people up in the mountains where the golf courses were. That's literally Tucson. And it's only gotten worse since. There's now it's like 40 some odd % unemployment rates where I grew up now. And it's just impoverished. It looks really bad. I'm like, God help us. I'm so glad, God, you saved me from this neighborhood. But yeah, but America, it's becoming more impoverished. We know this. But what I'm saying is that there was definitely a social class where I grew up. So if I said, oh, where do you live? I live on the south side of Tucson. So when I got a scholarship to go to a private Christian school by an angel donor. So we got out of the public school in the ghetto, and we drove 45 minutes to go to this private Christian school, and I was the only biracial kid in my class, and then eventually we got a black kid. I was like, yeah, you know what I mean? And he was scholarship too. But it was so weird because when people like, hey, let's go hang out, I'm like, well, I live like past the mountain down, and like, where do you live? The south side? Like, ooh, like they were scared. They locked their doors, you know? Seriously. I felt that because that was kind of the culture. They grew up in a certain zip code. They had nice houses. We never invited people over to our house. And one time, even one of my friends said, my mom won't let me go there. It's a bad side of the neighborhood. And I get it. And I'm like, yeah, it's probably a good idea, especially you driving that car. Probably, you won't have tires, after you. But like, so there's some truth to some of this oppression that happens to some extent. And so people would look at me, though, what wokeness does is the woke mob, if you will, they automatically have pity on me. And that's where minorities say, who are rational, critical ones, we say what? Time out. I don't need your pity. I worked my butt off to get to where I'm at today. I didn't need you to have pity on me. And see, so even people like Dr. Robin DiAngelo, who writes White Fragility, who's all being woke, guess what? She's the enlightened, educated white person who's going around talking on behalf of black people because they're not sophisticated enough to talk about their oppression, she says. So these days, I start with what it's not and more like a distortion because Christians need to understand the lies that are being perpetrated. Listen, you go to Gospel Coalition. How many of you guys have heard of Gospel Coalition? Guess what? And a lot of them are friends of mine, and we have internal debates privately. There's a lot of woke writers on the Gospel Coalition. Christianity Today. One of my friends, Joy Allman, is now the assistant executive director, and I'm fearing that Joy is going to become more woke, and she's been trained by me and other people, and Christianity Today is becoming, they have this distorted view. Now, I want to say that wokeness is not identity politics on steroids. Don't think intersectionality is more politically driven. It's not. Did you see anything here that has to do with politics? Does it say anything about, let me rephrase that, anything that's about government or the political system? No. But how much of this now has become political? All of it. So guess what, you guys? I was just saying this in an earlier session on Gen Z. Guess who's the biggest voting bloc coming in 2024? Millennials. And guess how millennials filter their politics through? Sexuality, intersectionality, inclusivity, and equity. That's it. Not limited government. Okay, so guess what? Universal health care. Why? Sounds good. Because you have a right to universal health care. Abortion is not what it used to be called a what? No. How do they use it to pass Roe v. Wade? A medical procedure. Now it's what? It's a human right. It's a healthcare right, okay? That comes through this. That's seeing it like this. And that's why it becomes political. So intersectionality is basically a lens, a prism for seeing the way in which various forms of inequality often operate together and exasperate each other. We tend to talk about race inequality as separate from inequality based on gender, class, sexuality, or immigrant status. What's often missing is how some people are subject to all of these, and the experience is not just the sum of its parts. So the other night, I'm sitting there with my pastor, who's a good friend of mine, and he had his oldest daughter and her husband, who is originally from Mexico City. His name is Danielle, and he's a devout Catholic, and he's been reading and following me lately, and he wanted to get to know me better, and so we've become, acquainted more and more, and they were in town recently, and they had us over for dinner, and so we're hanging out, and Danielle has a strong accent, and he's very educated, and he does finance, and he's been trying to get a job. He's not a citizen yet. He's got a work visa. He's based out of Houston. He's trying to get a job in Charlotte so he could be closer to his wife's family. And that's what they feel. And we've been praying for him, and I was checking up on him the other night. And basically, this is what Danielle told me. He has seen time and time again of him getting passed up by white males who are underqualified. He's older than them. He's been doing the business longer, but he's a Mexican on a work visa. And I said, and Danielle is not, again, guys, listen, he is not saying that because he feels he's being oppressed and he's all woke and he's going to sue his company. He's just saying, Jay, there are some facts here. There are some truths that we have to go through this. And I said, Danielle, do you really think that if you were an American citizen, at least an American citizen, right, that you would probably get hired in Charlotte? He says, probably. The moment they see that, a lot of people, they look the other way, okay? Now, so in some cases, where is intersectionality happening in the banking industry? Some cases, it's not, right? So again, when we evaluate this, what we don't want to do is we don't want to filter it through this. Is that biblical? Do we see people this way? No, it's not biblical. So should Christians be woke based on intersectionality? No. I can see the oppression that my brother Danielle's going through without being woke. Okay? Now, do I see that as an injustice of what's happening to Danielle? Does he see it as an injustice? No, he doesn't. Sometimes it's just favoritism. Sometimes it's just blind allegiance to what people know. We can't assume that just because he's overlooked, it's because they're white racists, Christian nationalists, okay? And Danielle's not even saying that, you guys, because I asked him point blank. I said, do you think they're racist? Do you think this? Do you think that? I'm asking him. He's like, no, Jay, no. So that's intersectionality. Now let's deal with the second layer, inclusivity. This is promoting fairness for all. I should say no matter their race, ethnicity, religion, or gender. Okay? On the face of it, that sounds great. Who wants more fairness? We just talked about some people who are oppressed, like a certain gender. I don't like using that term, but gender female. What about black females? Anybody have any Asian friends? Okay, good. A lot of times people are like, Jackie Chan. I'm like, what? So inclusivity, promoting fairness, no matter the race, ethnicity, religion, or gender, okay? There's a thing that I want you guys to be aware of called Gospel of Inclusion by Brandon Robertson. Gospel of Inclusion. So what they say based on inclusivity is, look, did Jesus love everybody? We're like, yes. So what does that mean? That means if Jesus embraced an LGBT kid in the Gospels, like if they, because it was outlawed then, so Jesus wasn't around that. But if he loved Zacchaeus, if he loved Matthew, if he brought Matthew as one of his fold, they're remember, these are apples and oranges, but the inclusive gospel teaching and wokeness is that Jesus loved all people. And yet you're like, that's true. But notice they reject the very definition of original sin. So they're not identifying this based through sin. They're just saying all people, which means then all lifestyles. Okay? So they say inclusivity within wokeness is that the gospel welcomes every lifestyle, belief, and marriage. Okay? Now, Dr. D'Angelo, when you look back at her stuff, one of the things that she's trying to do is not just identifying white fragility, but this inclusivity that needs to take shape. But in order to do that, white people have to deconstruct their way of living, right? So what we're going through in the South right now, for example, is they don't use the term in Charlotte now. This is like a big thing. Is what were properties called that owned slaves? Plantations. So we've literally been seeing certain like huge, magnificent, beautiful, multi-million-dollar things that have the word plantation on being scraped off and putting the word estate. If you look at some of the new modern renovators, realtors, they don't have the word master bedroom, right? Aunt Jemima, that's done. Dixie Chicks, that stuff, that's not being inclusive, right? Those are offensive terms. But the bottom line for people like D'Angelo, if you're white and therefore there's racism in you, then the way that you look at life is not inclusive enough. So the more inclusive you become, the less racist you are. Now, are Christians to be inclusive like that? Are we to judge ourselves because of the color of our skin? Are we to change our ways and assume the way your parents raised you was wrong? If your grandparents owned slaves, are you at fault for that? But there's racism in your blood and you're not inclusive enough. So one way to renounce the racism in you can never get rid of your whiteness, okay? I was just doing recent research on another talk, and there's no joke, there's a Norwegian woman, she was a flight attendant, that she went through a series of tests, and the doctors have been injecting her for quite some time now with high levels of melanin. And she's had plastic surgery and got big lips and, changed a lot of stuff back there. And also, hair extensions and stuff like that. And so she's now a black woman. And I'll tell you, it looks worse than Michael Jackson. Okay, it's like a reverse Michael Jackson thing going on here. And it's like, she was a blonde, blue-eyed white woman from Norway. And now she still talks like that, right? So it's really weird. But now she's trying to look like she's, some black woman, right? And she's trying to, and one reason she said, I like the curves on black women. Like, man, you're saying a lot of like offensive terminology as though only black women have curves. But I'm like listening to this stuff. This is like what wokeness does on steroids, okay? So inclusivity, you guys, is an inclusive gospel at the heart of it now that says Jesus loved all people and all religions are accepted by Jesus. And you have to be very careful. And so when D'Angelo and them are talking about white fragility, they're telling you to be more inclusive. And if you who are white, and again, you have that religion background, like you have to renounce a lot of that. You're not being inclusive enough. And so what's happened is a lot of people in the workplace is then they back off. They stop wearing crosses. They start bringing the Bible. They stop having Bible studies because they feel like people are taking that as a very offensive. And I don't want to offend people. And as Christians, we are not to offend people, right? That's not the Jesus way. And then they do what? They shut down. Now, they may not approve of everything in the camp of inclusivity, but notice what they've done. They've compromised. And they haven't really been bullied. It's a self-perception that demoralizes you and you go into silence. Women are more emotionally driven to these causes, than men are. Men still, by nature, are more critical and rational, right?
Yeah.
So they're responding like saying, that doesn't make sense. That's a load of crap, right? And that's how a guy just deals with it. And a woman's like, yeah, but they're oppressed and they're hurting. You know what I mean? We got to renounce our faith. It's interesting. 15 years ago, it was coming home saying, I no longer believe I'm an atheist. That was like the big thing. 15 years later, it's like woke.
Right.
Like atheism is not even placated. It's like, I'm spiritual, I'm enlightened, and I'm judging you. It's one thing, it's like, give me the evidence, there's no God, blah, 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 blah. Now it's like, you don't love people. You're not wearing a mask, you didn't get your booster shot times 10, you know what I mean? And the vitamin pills to take the booster shot, from CVS, and all that kind of, and it's like, oh, you got them at CVS, you didn't get them at Walgreens, okay, you're not boosted enough. And it's like this back and forth, and you're gonna kill humanity, right? And you're a murderer. And then they're out there, for marching for women's rights to have an abortion. But that's wokeness, right? And that's why a lot of people, they can see right through it. But what happens is, remember, it's not the actual cause. It's not the LGBT community that advances their cause. It's people that sympathize for them and feel guilt-ridden that advance the cause. Heterosexual couples are the ones that got Obergefell case legalized by same-sex marriage. It was heterosexual couples. It wasn't the gay community. Owen Strachan, he says, quote, guilt is absolutely the currency of wokeness.
That's it.
So one of the things I tell people is like, when you look at scripture, how often do you see God the Father, Jesus Christ, and the Holy Spirit guilt-ridden you, shaming you? That's not wokeness. That's judging me harshly. Pastor Paul, let me put it like this. This is what we often say to people. So first, Jesus loved all people, but he didn't love all ideas. And he didn't support all causes, but advanced one kingdom, his own. So right there now, when I'm talking to somebody who's woke, is we have to deal with 4 layers. Jesus did love all people, but he didn't love all ideas. And he didn't support all causes. And he was only ultimately advancing one kingdom, his own. And what does that look like? And that's when we deal with sin. And that's when we're dealing with, yes, rigidity over here, and corruption there, and religiosity, and pride, and arrogance, okay? But he exposed the falsity of certain aspects of the law. So he loved all people, but he did not love all ideas. And he did not support all the causes of his day. And he was only there on this planet to advance one kingdom, and that was his own. And that's when he started addressing the lostness, the brokenness of his creation from himself. And the only way to restore it was him dying on the cross for our sins. Okay? Ministry to any human being is an ongoing process. Okay? Very rarely should we ever in any relationship say, okay, I think we've arrived, I think we're done. Unless you're getting a divorce. I think I've had enough of you, okay? So it's a sign here. So it's an ever-evolving process. So I do think that the older that we get in life, I know now at my stage in life, in my mid-40s, where I actually surround myself with a lot more people that I disagree with than before, right? I'm a lot more comfortable in my worldview, and I love people, and I'm not intimidated. And I love learning about atheists and woke people, that kind of thing, you know what I mean? And so I when I share these kind of things with them, I'm getting them to think. What I would say for the Christian standpoint to what Paul's saying is, I do think it's very important for us to approach it by showing them this and saying, okay, when you say woke, let's go through these 4 areas. Let's talk about intersectionality. Let's talk about inclusivity. Let's unpack these things so that I can better understand. A lot of times they're like, well, I wouldn't want to really say that. And I would probably, and then you start finding out is that they're just kind of using terminology that they're not really familiar with. And then you start saying, okay, well, let's get into the scripture and let's see what the scripture does support when we're talking about injustices and oppressions and things like that. Now, let me just pause and say this before we move on. And I did a video about this guy. He did the Color of Compromise. Jamar Tisby, who came from the southeastern, was raised, in academics with Southern Baptist, very conservative professor. He's gone woke, okay? Anytime you go on Twitter, you just see this guy just now unleashing, and he is the well-beloved saint, black, conservative professor, if you will. And what he's done now is he has taken a black theology, a liberal theology, to the text. So when Jesus was quoting from Luke 4, right, you see in Luke 4, he's quoting from the scroll in Isaiah, he takes that to not look as sin, the Messiah coming in to restore people from their sin, being far from God, but coming and bringing deliverance to the oppressed, like black people, like slaves. And they go back to Hebrew, to the Hebrew people. They were slaves. So that's black liberal theology, okay? And that's a form of wokeness from the standpoint of someone like Jemar Tisby, okay? So again, it will look different. So if I'm sitting there talking to Jemar, my approach would be different. Most of this that I'm sharing with you, he agrees with. And he's teaching churches. And you know what? They can't get enough of him. Let me finish this quote. So guilt is absolutely the currency of wokeness. It really is targeting white people. It wants white people to feel tremendous guilt for past evils. And those are real evils, things like slavery and Jim Crow law, things no person in their sane mind is going to support. But wokeness says the past is not the past. Basically, the crimes of yesterday burn today. You can smell them in the air. We need to impute guilt to white people today because their whiteness implicates them in this whole systemic order of racism. And if we can successfully make them feel guilty, then we will advance our ideas and we will succeed in flipping the culture, which is really what this movement is about. That's why I told you guys, inclusivity is you deconstructing from your belief systems. You need to become more inclusive to remove that racism in your life. So ultimately what you're doing is you're compromising in your whole being to become something that God never intended you to be. That's not Christianity. That's not what Jesus taught. That's not what we see in the Pauline epistles. This is about them flipping the culture. It's not about promoting true unity in the gospel. I've told that to many people to their face. I said, this is actually racism. I'm not saying you're a racist, but I've had white people tell me about my own culture. I was speaking in front of a bunch of college students, and this Asian guy in the Q&A immediately, just like this. I'm like, okay. And I just did a talk called, another talk I give on, should Christians be anti-racist? And of course, I cover more Ibram X. Kendi in that talk. Asian guy from California. And there's like 200 students in this room, okay? And he says, all right, so I tend to joke. He says, I'm a jokester. I'm like, okay, that's great. And he says, I imitate my family who come from China. And he starts imitating them because I was like, okay, give me an example. Talk like your grandpa, you know? So he starts going all Chinese, you know, and everyone starts laughing like that. And he says, so my question is, I have white friends, and everybody starts laughing, and that was funny, you know? I don't know why, but when he said that. And he says, but one time I was doing that, and they're all like, and he's like no one's laughing, and they're all like, looking at him like, you can't do that. What are you doing? And he's like, what do you mean I'm doing? He's like, I'm impersonating my family. I'm like, no, that's offensive. You can't do that. He's like, so my question is, can I be doing that about my family? And is that racist? And I said, let me get this straight. So your 4 white friends are telling you what you cannot do in your own culture as a Chinese man imitating your Chinese family. And he said, yes. And I said, that, my friends, is wokeness, right? That's the point in all of this. Wokeness leads to cancel culture. Wokeness cancels itself out by definition, right? They are trying to change the culture. They're not promoting true unity. And so I've called many of them out on that. A lot of them don't listen to reason. I think actually one of the worst ones that is destroying America is equity. Allocating exact resources based on someone's disadvantage. You know, one of the biggest problems I had with Obama was he was all about equal outcome. And the government's job was to make that happen. No, it isn't. Equity is a false push for equality and unity. It comes from a Marxist ideology. Who defines the classless societies? Have you ever wondered that? Who decides the classless societies? Elitism. So this is egalitarianism on steroids. There is no equal outcome. Essentially what happens is, and they talk about this, Ibram X. Kendi, they can't help themselves. They have to admit it. In order for you to remove discrimination, what do you have to advance? Discrimination. They call it racial or class discrimination. So in 2020, the Smithsonian Institute published an infographic on the, quote, the aspects and assumptions of whiteness and white culture. It's a great read. It listed things like objective, rational, linear thinking and, quote, cause and effect relationships, end quote, and ideas like hard work is the key to success as elements of whiteness. Did you hear that? You might expect statements like this from neo-Nazism. Seriously, it's like reading from a neo-Nazi manifesto. But this infographic, you guys, was published by the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. So math is racist now. And get this, and I grew up in a community that had a bridge that bypassed parts of my neighborhood and connected to another side of town. Bridges are racist too, because they all started in inner cities and it was white people bypassing the slum. So if you have a bridge in your neighborhood, you're racist. Whereas Obama did the bridge to nowhere. So on multiple occasions, when you go back to Jemar Tisby and Ibram X. Kendi, for example, and there's another guy named Edo Lodge, these three writers advance a form of anti-racism. So if you are not advancing equity, you're a racist. So if you're not taking what you have and evaluating that, okay, I got to where I'm at because I'm white. I'm better educated. I was raised in a home of objectivity, rational linear thinking, cause and effect relationships with my parents. Hard work and success was a big motto in my family. All of that is what? Considered by the Smithsonian as what? As racist ideology. Your parents, you didn't even know this. When your parents are saying, work hard, they were teaching you to be a racist. No, this is the Smithsonian Institute in America that are teaching this stuff. So allocating exact resources based on someone's disadvantage, you guys, is a horrible philosophy. I'm skipping through. I'm going to read you guys this one thing so we can wrap up. Let me share this real quick. Now, because put this down, guys. Jemar Tisby, Jemar, Jemar Tisby, Tisby, one of the biggest evangelical black theologians that preaches in churches all over the country every Sunday, podcasts, the books, the major Christian outlets publish his stuff. I have tons of people in my own church that I attend that love Jemar Tisby. Listen to this. There are many faulty and sometimes vague assumptions in his book, The Color of Compromise, or in this case, another book called How to Fight Racism. So this is what happened. And I was making a little light joke earlier. The white churches looked around, they said, are we doing anything about racism in our church? Well, no, we need to do something. All right, so go find a black Christian writer, buy his book, and let's start a Bible study right away for the church. And who do they turn to when they did that? Jemar Tisby. And you know, it's so perfect because he wrote a book called How to Fight Racism. And I want to be the church that's woke or that's against racism, right? As Christians, do we believe in racism? Of course not. But what he does is he teaches about this racial justice that you have to be a part of in this form of equity. And on pages 5 and 6 of his book, this is what Tisby writes. To enact society-wide change, people must commit to deconstructing laws that have a disparate impact on people of different races and rewrite those rules so they lead to greater equity among people of all races and ethnicities, end quote. Now, if you notice, Tisby's definition is never well defined, and he lacks a path of biblical justice and restoration within the mixtures of ethnicity. There is no pathway, you guys, to their writings, because what is it driven by? Guilt. So what happened is a lot of these church leaders that I've talked to around the country, they're like, we got to do something about racism. We got the black guy to come in here to teach us how to fight racism. And ultimately what they're now doing is they're being anti-racist, who are advancing equity, intersectionality, et cetera, et cetera. And they put biblical justice terminologies to everything. Now, I recommend one of my friends, I did some videos on my show. You can check out my YouTube channel. His name is Neil Shinvey. He posted a blog on his website entitled A House Divided, and he reviews this book by Jemar Tisby, How to Fight Racism. And this is what Neil points out. There's two primary concerns about equity. Remember, this is being taught in our church, you guys. This is why I bring up this one specific. First, Tisby, he tends to conflate racial disparities. Now remember, my background, what I grew up in, the difference between what we were going through in my family life and knowing that there are certain disparities. But what you will find with equity and the advancement of wokeness is they will take racial disparities and what do? They conflate them. What do we say about Baptists when they have a revival? What do they tend to do about the conversions or baptisms? They tend to conflate them, right? Like 30 people got baptized. Like, we had 300 people, guys. It was amazing. God was moving. And the second concern has to do with Tisby's use of equity over equality. Tisby's distinction between equality and equity, which is common in an anti-racist circles, explicitly and intentionally challenges colorblind approaches to racial justices. So the moment you kind of feel like, well, I haven't really been doing a lot to fight racism, you know why? Because of your color blindness. Because you've been so privileged. And you're like, you know what, I have been. Well, I've been so privileged. I've been so grateful. And like, you got to feel bad. Instead of what? Thanking God for your what? The blessings that you have. Of course, this distinction is sometimes reasonable. No one thinks that it is unfair to build wheelchair ramps on the grounds that we are giving special treatment to disabled individuals. So yes, there are times, like I received a transfer scholarship in my community. Otherwise, I would never have had that opportunity based on my community. So if you put a wheelchair ramp, is that special treatment to a special class of people? We know that that is a needed asset for people who have a disability. It is within our responsibility to meet that need. But this is what they conflate. On the other hand, many people are understandably uncomfortable with the idea that race alone entails that a particular individual needs differential treatment to offset the disadvantages they face. To give special consideration to a wealthy black student whose parents are both doctors on the grounds that he is somehow disadvantaged seems both unrealistic and condescending. But the narrative of wokeness with equity, that's what you do. Because you go back to the model I showed you in that circle. They're building it around their intersectionality, right? Their equity, their race, etc. In other words, in Tisby's mind, anything that perpetuates inequities is the result of what? Anything that perpetuates inequities is because of racism. That's why, guys, hear me in closing on equity. Systemic racism does not exist. But to be woke, you believe in systemic racism. And again, this is another faulty thinking of wokeness. Who runs these institutions to begin with? Conservatives? So if racism is systemic in education, in criminal justice, in politics, who runs those institutions primarily? Liberals. White, liberal, educated people. So guess what? Some of the most racist people actually in America are what? White liberals, educated ones. So it flies in the face. Racism, they say, perpetuates inequities, which would mean that any wealth achieved is because of discrimination, not because of success, not because of hard work. So on one side, if there's inequity, it's because of racism. And if you make money and you're a success, it's because of discrimination. By the same token, any poverty experienced by a person of color is because of discrimination. Therefore, to level the playing field, it is necessary to steal from those who have more so that minorities can have their fair share. So to advance equity and equality, you have to implant a form of discrimination to reduce discrimination. What? Remember the famous politician? You got to spend money to save money. The last one in closing is sexuality. I think we get this one. Sexuality comes in all different sizes, shapes and sizes, and is determined by the individual person, how one feels physically, emotionally towards someone. It just depends. So I need you guys to understand there's 3 categories here within the wokeness. There's sexual orientation. I talk about this in my Q&A book, or in Challenging Conversations. This is what they feel. This is what the term orientation is, what they're orientated towards. If it's the same sex, if it's asexual, whatever. That's their orientation based on their sexuality. It will look different depending on the person. And we need to be woke to know that when people say, I am gay, what are they saying? That's my identity. That's my belief. That's the core of who I am. That's a westernized view that goes back to who? Guess what famous psychologist this originated from? Sigmund Freud. So there's sexual orientation, and then there's sexual identity. And sexual identity or gender identity is that belief that when they're saying, I am this normity of their nature is based on their sexuality and how they feel physically, spiritually, emotionally. It impacts every aspect of their life. Therefore, it's their makeup, okay? And then there's gender dysphoria. And gender dysphoria describes gender dysphoria as it's a deep and abiding discomfort over the incongruence between one's biological sex. So it's not necessarily a confusion of who they are based on their desires sexually or what they believe them to be. Not every kid that struggles with their gender identity is saying because I'm attracted to the same sex or the opposite sex. Does that make sense? So we cannot confuse it. I wish we can go back and re-educate a lot of us in this because we automatically assume that if somebody has dysphoria and they're a biological male, but they have these elements or moments of time where they dream of being a female, that's not to say that they are attracted to females. So gender dysphoria, and my buddy Mark Yarhouse, he's a psychologist. I agree with a lot of his stuff, and we're finding that there are kids who, for whatever reason, I don't believe people are born gay, but I do believe there are some people who have a higher propensity, for whatever reason, towards this in some aspects. And gender dysphoria in our culture today, with a lot of demonic activity as well, and broken homes and sexual abuse and trauma or exposure to porn, all that stuff plays into some dysphoria. And so there's a discomfort, and it has to do with this incongruence between their biological sex and their psychological makeup. There's a disconnect. And yes, if we don't treat that, if we don't help that family, that young person who is developing physically and physiologically, we're seeing what's happening. And they get a hold of a TikToker and lights out, it's over. So these are important aspects, you guys. When you're talking about should Christians be wokeness, the simple response is no, based on what the culture teaches what wokeness is. It's countercultural to the gospel. So God bless you. Amen. All right, guys. Paul,
Let's just say thank
appreciate
you.
it.